Welcome to the Proceedings Podcast. I'm Bill Hamblet, the editor-in-chief of Proceedings at the U.S. Naval Institute. Today is Thursday, October 3rd here in Annapolis, and it's Friday, October 4th in Australia. More on that in a minute. Good to have you on board, everyone. This episode is brought to you by Booz Allen. Accelerate today's missions with tomorrow's technologies. As the leader in providing AI solutions to the federal government and one of the world's largest cybersecurity providers, Booz Allen advances game-changing capabilities rapidly, ethically, and securely. Learn more at boozallen.com/defense. Joining me today from Australia is Mick Ryan, the author of The War for Ukraine, Strategy and Adaptation Under Fire, published recently by the Naval Institute Press. General Ryan, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Bill. It's great to be with you again. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, for the audience, just a bit of background. General Ryan is a retired Australian Army Major General. He's a distinguished graduate of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, as well as the U.S. Marine Corps Command and Staff College and the School of Advanced Warfare. He's also the author of another Naval Institute Press book, which was published in 2022. And there's another episode of the Proceedings podcast on that book. It was titled War Transformed: The Future of 21st Century Great Power Competition and Conflict. And like that book, this one, The War for Ukraine, is just superbly done. So congratulations on a great book, sir.
Thank you very much. A lot of hard work, and I'm glad it's finally out there.
Yeah, so the book's fantastic, but the war is still raging, right? And other authors might have waited for the war to end before tackling a book. So why write a book while the war is still being fought?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. When I pitched this book to USNI and Naval Institute Press have been amazing again in the whole process of publishing this book. So I'd like to thank the whole team there. As I say at the start of the book, this is part of a story of part of a war. You never actually see the whole war in its entirety. Even in retrospect, there's still things about previous wars that remain unknown or mysterious to us. But I also think the world is moving so quickly, we can't afford to wait to learn. We need to take every opportunity to learn as quickly as possible. And therefore, I felt there was an imperative to make some initial observations that would be useful now for Western military institutions to begin their own processes of transformation, maybe not exactly the same as the Ukrainians have undergone, but we need to transform for some of the new technologies and some of the new threats, and the lessons of Ukraine can help that process.
Yeah, and it jumped out to me as I was reading it that you have you talk about not only strategy that the Ukrainians have and the Russians have, and the NATO Western strategy so far. You also offer what Ukraine's strategy might be going forward, and what NATO and the West should do. So that's a good segue. And I don't want to get into partisan politics because there are a lot of people in the United States who question spending billions of dollars to defend Ukraine. So in your words, what's at stake? Why do you think it's important that the West help Ukraine preserve its independence, its territorial integrity from Russia?
Yeah, first I'd say that people questioning various government spending initiatives, whether it's Ukraine or otherwise, is healthy in a democracy. It's not a bad thing that people might question the expenditure of money on foreign interventions or domestic issues. I think that's entirely helpful and healthy in a democracy. So what we do need to do, however, is ensure that in that debate there is good purpose provided for why Ukraine is being supported. And I think there is some very sound strategic foundations for supporting Ukraine. First and foremost is to push back on aggression by large authoritarians who feel that their time has come, not just Russia, but North Korea, Iran, and most importantly, China. And if we allow a Russia to get away with what it's getting away with now in Ukraine, which is not just invading a neighbor, but brutalizing its people, conducting a global misinformation campaign, torturing, raping, looting, kidnapping, if they get away with that, that will just encourage others of the same mind, of which Iran, China, and North Korea are just 3 examples, to do the same. We can't afford that. Our people deserve better, and the people who live in close proximity to those countries deserve better as well. So for me, that is the principal reason that we should be supporting Ukraine. Clearly, there's also a moral imperative. You know, the people of Ukraine are a prosperous young democracy who deserve to survive. But I think that its strategic imperative is clear. I just don't think we've always been good at making that case to many people in many democracies around the world.
Yeah, that's a great point. So there are several major themes in your book. Strategy, leadership, and adaptation are 3 key ones that stood out to me as I read it. So I want to dive into each one of those. Describe for us what Russia's strategy was at the start of the war, and how has Vladimir Putin and the Russian strategy changed in the last 2 years now.
Yeah, the initial Russian strategy was for a lightning operation of about a 10-day duration, and it was primarily military. There were some other information aspects and diplomatic aspects, but it was primarily military. But the strategy was founded on 3 key assumptions. The first assumption was that the Ukrainians wouldn't fight, or they certainly wouldn't fight to the degree that would cause any difficulties to the force that was allocated by the Russians. The second assumption is that the Ukrainian government would quickly fold or be captured, which would make it either a puppet or irrelevant to Russia's requirements. And the third assumption was that NATO and the United States would largely acquiesce to this, similar to what had happened with Georgia, what had happened in Chechnya, what had happened in Syria, what had happened in 2014. The problem for Putin is he got all 3 of those assumptions wrong, which really invalidated his strategy. And at the end of the day, his strategy was dashed on the rocks of Ukrainian resilience and courage at the gates of Kiev. And that battle in particular changed the course of the war and forced the Russians to really rethink their strategy for subjugating Ukraine.
And you describe Ukraine's strategy as one of attrition, exhaustion, and corrosion. And that last word, corrosion, really jumped out at me. I hadn't heard the word corrosion in the context of military strategy before. Talk about that for a minute, if you would.
Yeah, that's certainly a term that's upset some of the purists, I guess, when it comes to strategy. I mean, Hans Delbrück's old approach of exhaustion or attrition is really how much of our strategic theory has evolved over the last century, and I think that's entirely appropriate. But I think in the 21st century, you're seeing larger parts of society in direct contact with each other, through whether it's through crowdfunding, through misinformation, through social media, through large-scale mobilization of citizens for both industry and the military. And for me, that indicates, the surface area of societies that are in contact with each other in war are increasing. And at the end of the day, corrosion is all about, having an impact on the largest surface area as possible. And for this war, a strategy of corrosion is having an impact across the largest part of the societies that are engaged possible. So that's why I chose the term. It may not go down in history as a third element of strategic foundations, but I thought it was the right term to use, given that there were some new features of this war on top of a whole lot of old ones that were worth paying attention to.
Yeah, I'm remembering now from reading your early couple of chapters, that discussion in the book also of that surface area, the larger surface area of not just frontline troops clashing it out in battle, which we've certainly seen unfold in the news coverage daily for 2.5 years now, but also the social media, the civil military relationship, how the Russian population is adapting and dealing and perhaps struggling under Putin's, all of those things, that it resounded with me, that idea of corrosion, when you explained it that way in the book. So I found it apt, but it also a novel way to describe it. Let's talk about leadership for a minute, because there's also a lot about leadership in the book. So compare and contrast Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. In the book, you measure both men with 4 or 5 sort of key lenses, right? The mastery of their language is one, their use of media, their battlefield visits, their authenticity, and their collaborative leadership. We could spend a lot of time on all those factors, but choose 1 or 2, if you would, as lenses to examine Putin and Zelensky for us.
Yeah, I think the first one I'd choose is courage. And, the battlefield visits is just one example of that. But, if you contrast Zelensky, his worst day, February 2022, was Russia invading his country from multiple directions. He has a phone call from the US ambassador, allegedly, that, we can helicopter you out. And he says, no, I'm staying with my people. Now, that was a very, very big call, and I propose that it fundamentally altered the trajectory of the war. If he had have left, it's hard to imagine Ukraine being as unified as it has been. It may well have been, but it's hard to imagine the same level of unity. What he did, unified his people and said to them all, we're all going to stay and fight. Um, Contrast that with Putin. When Prigozhin began his march on Moscow, even though it wasn't much of a march and there's no way he was going to make it to Moscow, Putin got out of town pretty quickly. So even the smallest threats to Putin, he scurries away like a cockroach, because his first imperative always is his own survival. Whereas Zelensky is not that kind of leader. His first imperative has been the survival of his nation. So I think that is a very important contrast between the two leaders. And I think that's driven all the other elements of their leadership for the duration of this war so far.
Yeah, that's a really key point. And you bring out in the book what a lot of people may have, forgotten in the last, 2.5 years of watching Zelensky in action. But on the eve of the war kicking off, his national approval level was quite low. Correct? It was in the 30%, 20%, something like that.
Yeah, I think it was something between 27 and 29%. He was a very inexperienced politician who'd been elected on a platform of reducing corruption, reducing the influence of the oligarchs. And he'd been working on that. But it's a tough ask in a country that had the institutional challenges that Ukraine did have in the years between 1991 and 2022. The war really provided him with an opportunity, as awful as it has been, to show his real character and to show his courage and to show his resilience and determination in the face of, the kind of thing that very, very few 21st century leaders in democracies have had to face.
Yeah, that's a great point. So the book has several chapters that deal with adaptation, tactical, operational, and strategic level adaptation. Give us an example or two of Russian and Ukrainian adaptation that are most notable to you.
Yeah, I think adaptation is one of the most crucial characteristics that any military organization can possess and nurture. I've been studying this for nearly quarter of a century, and I've used it on operations and in transformation projects at home. And I've seen in this war, both the Ukrainians and Russians have learned and adapted at different levels. Both of them had a foundation for it through their transformation activities before the war. It didn't just emerge out of nowhere. But I think if you have a look at the Ukrainians, their grassroots innovation from the use of civil drones from day one in the Battle of Kiev has been important. How they have been able to mesh together civil, military, territorial forces in defense of their country has been pretty remarkable. And how they've been able to adapt, evolve, and build a defence industry to support that has been amazing. Under the just finished Defence Minister, Minister Kamishin, they tripled defence output in 2022, doubled again last year, and they've been increasing it again. I mean, this is a really significant innovation and adaptation for a country that largely got rid of its defence industry at the end of the Cold War. They still have problems, however, scaling their adaptations. They don't have the same size defence industry as Russia does. But at the same time, they have been able to absorb, Western technologies very well, whether it's been HIMARS, whether it's Western main battle tanks or artillery or air defence system, and kind of adapt the Ukrainian system to be a mix of Soviet, Ukrainian, and Western ideas and technologies. I think that's their real superpower, is being able to do that. But the Russians, I think, are slower at adapting on the battlefield. Their centralized control, their reticence to report failure hinders adaptation, but it hasn't stopped it entirely. And we've seen them adapt their meat tactics, where they use criminals to basically absorb machine gun bullets and indicate where the Ukrainians are, is one approach. The turtle tanks is another one. The use of motorcycle-borne troops is another one. I don't know that that's been terribly successful. But I think one of the lessons of adaptation on the battlefield is that not every adaptation works, but it's what you learn from even failed adaptation that matters. And I think the other thing I'd draw is that the Ukrainians are superior at battlefield adaptation, but have problems scaling it just because of the size of the defense industry. The Russians are the opposite. They have problems with battlefield adaptation, but once they do learn a lesson, they're able to scale up and to industrialize it better than the Ukrainians. So that includes their use of drones and loitering munitions, their employment of electronic warfare, or just the large-scale deployment of cope cages on all their vehicles.
Yeah, it is rather amazing, when you mention it about the ability of Ukraine to. I know that they're challenged to scale it up, but what they've done with their defense industry, the fact that they can produce anything for themselves when their electrical grid and their industry is under constant bombardment and attack, that's pretty impressive, right?
It's remarkable when you think about it. The pressures they're under, the capacity they had beforehand, and over a 34-month period, they've built a strategic strike complex that achieves extraordinary things. Now, obviously, it requires still a lot of support from the United States to do that, particularly with some of the weapons and some of the targeting and intelligence. But still, to build what they've got over a 34-month period is really quite extraordinary.
Yeah, the unmanned surface vessels, the little high-speed sort of jet skis adapted with explosive charges that have taken out several of the Russian Navy Black Sea Fleet ships are notable. Like, that surprised me. It was like, wow, look at that. They've invented something of their own and used it to great effect. In effect, that the Ukrainian Navy without a navy has done a very successful sea denial campaign in the Black Sea, to the effect that almost the entire Russian Black Sea Fleet is now on the other side, the far sort of northeast side of the Black Sea, and staying there, right? Staying out of harm's way. So that's another great example of adaptation. I would be remiss if I didn't bring out one example that just really struck me, that's in the book. You mentioned how your Russians have sort of adapted on the battlefield to the trench warfare, to this, sort of static line, but also, the ubiquitous surveillance that the Ukrainians have and the Russians have as well. But the Russians are using this human trickle, which is small packets of disposable infantry. I think a minute ago you mentioned meat tactics. And these disposable infantry, often on amphetamines, that jumped out at me, to go forward and skirmish until killed. But it's like probing until they find the Ukrainians, and then they can back up the attack with, more substantive fires, I guess. But Man, I mean, that is adaptation. It's a bit Mad Max and brutal, but it is certainly, it shows Russian adaptation on the battlefield.
Yeah, I think it shows, the Russians aren't totally stupid. They are capable of thinking and adapting. And whilst it's not the kind of adaptations that we in most Western militaries would consider,
Yeah,
it is a form of learning and adaptation from, let's not call them aliens, but it's a very different way of thinking. And if we are going to confront authoritarians in the 21st century, we need to understand better how aliens might think, because the Chinese and Russians think very differently to what we do, and we have to understand that better. Yeah, I'll just quickly go back to the maritime element of the war. I mean, this is not a land war. This is a multi-domain war.
sure.
There's a lot going on the land, but boy, there's a lot going on in the skies. There's a huge amount that the Ukrainian Navy have done in the Black Sea that they deserve far more credit for. Cyberspace information operations are all crucial to this. So, there's a lot of lessons for multi-domain and cross-domain warfare that we can be learning here. We obviously need to filter those lessons through different strategic and geographic contexts. But this isn't just a land war in Europe. This is a true 21st century multi-domain war from which we can all learn something.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's certainly, for the U.S. as Americans, think in terms of joint warfare, joint operations, and the lessons from what's happening in Ukraine are certainly joint lessons or multi-domain, as you point out, sir. So I want to harken back to your previous book, War Transformed. We had you on the show, I think, 2 years ago to talk about that. At that time, the book was written before the war in Ukraine kicked off, but I think we had you on the show after the war had started, and so this was sort of a nascent part of that conversation. What themes in that book, War Transformed, have you seen play out in the ongoing war? And what things maybe surprised you?
Yeah, I think most of the themes in the book are still entirely relevant. I think back this new era of mass. I think when I suggested that, people thought I might have been smoking something, but we've seen, mass artillery, mass tanks, mass autonomous systems, mass information systems. As I said, it's not our grandfather's mass. It's kind of that with new elements from the 21st century. So I think that was an important theme.
I
I
think
think
there's a
the
place.
integrate.
Yeah, I think there's a place in the book where you mention it as industrial scale warfare, right? That a lot of people had sort of thought, and Western military, analysts and practitioners had even thought, well, we're never going to, um, conduct warfare at that sort of industrial scale again. But this shows that's not so true.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I thought the never again analysis was just wrong. You can never say that. And, everything we saw from both Russia and China indicated that they were thinking along the lines of industrialized warfare. And that's what's played out, not just in Russia, but from how China appears to be learning about the war as well. If there were two areas I'd probably focus more on in a subsequent edition of War Transform, one would be surprise and failure. I did focus on it, but I think the amount of surprise that's still possible in the 21st century when there's supposed to be this thing called a transparent battlefield, I think is still very interesting and talks to why human agency is still crucial in war. It's not about technology; it's about how the humans think. How they're given purpose, how they're led, and those kind of things. So that's something, and I might even pitch a book to somebody about that. We'll see. But the other thing would be just, even though I covered a lot in the book, I'd probably focus more on this massive expansion in the use of autonomous systems. This has been a trend we've all been looking at for some time. I've written about it, many others have written about it. But the trajectory since February 2024 has probably surprised 99.9% of analysts. I mean, it really has been explosive. It's called a Cambrian explosion for good reason, and it's been multi-domain. It's been in the air, it's been on the ocean, and increasingly on the land in a way that, has speeded up innovation and technological development, as well as new tactics and strategies for their employment that probably wasn't fully anticipated before the beginning of the war.
Yeah, that's a great point. Sir, a minute ago, I have to tell this story because a minute ago you mentioned used the word aliens when we were talking about how the Russians have, really done some brutal things with their own troops on the battlefield. So about 20 years ago, I was the naval attaché in Moscow, and when I went through the training, I went through training with a U.S. Army major who was Russia FAO, and he had been over there and served in Eastern Europe and studied in Russia, et cetera. And as we were finishing the training and heading off, he was headed to Moldova to be the defense attaché in Moldova. I was going to Moscow, and Rick, it's been great working with you and training with you, et cetera. And he goes, "Hey, you'll do fine. Just remember one thing." And I said, "Okay, one thing." He goes, "They're Klingons." And so for anybody who's a Star Trek fan, that was the reference. He said, and I've said, "They're Klingons." He said, "That's how different the Russians are from Western thinkers and even Western military people." So anytime that you don't understand where they're coming from, just apply that lens and it will become more clear to you. And I had to laugh a number of times when I would have conversations with Russians they would describe something and I would go, "Well, that doesn't make any sense." "Oh, no, no, now it makes sense. I'm remembering what Major Reno told me," which was brilliant. But exactly, you're going to put some of your criminals on amphetamines and put them at the front lines and tell them to go, charge forward until they make contact. And that's your probing, your scouting. That's how the Russians think, and that's how they're behaving. And it's just one example, right? But I had to tell that story because when you said the word aliens, I was like, yes, that's just a
Well,
wonderful, illumination
I,
of that
I
point.
think it's important that we don't have failures of humility here. The enemy will surprise us. We need to understand them better.
Yeah,
In fact, all those alien movies from the 50s, 60s, and 70s really were metaphors for Reds under the bed and the threat posed
yeah,
by the Soviet Union. So we've kind of been here before, but we really do need to invest in understanding Russian and Chinese thinking better. Now, there's a lot of UCOM and Indo-PACOM are doing that, and they're doing some amazing remarkable thinking. But I think collectively as nations, we probably need to do better at understanding these countries better.
yeah. Great point. Well, sir, do you have any saved rounds or questions that I should have asked but didn't ask you?
I think I just talk about, get back to this theme of leadership. I think whilst the book is about strategy and adaptation, both of them have to be led. They don't just happen. Both require good leadership, whether it's setting purpose for developing strategies, disciplined implementation and execution of strategies takes good leadership. But so too does adaptation. It will happen from the ground up in some respects, but at the end of the day, good systemic strategic adaptation requires good leadership and leaders who can nurture an environment where soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, and women are empowered to try new ideas, try new technologies, and then those leaders are about sharing them and investing in them. So, whilst the book's about strategy and adaptation, leadership is at the heart of both of these endeavors.
That's a great way to end it. That's a really, really key point. So, unfortunately, we're out of time. I could go on for this conversation for a long time. The book is The War for Ukraine: Strategy and Adaptation Under Fire. The author is Mick Ryan, retired Major General from the Australian Army. Sir, it's been great to have you on the show. If our listeners want to buy a copy of the book, and I recommend it, you can go to usni.org, click on Press and Books, search for Ukraine. The book pops right up. The writing is clear and insightful. It's full of citations, examples, and quotes. It helped put much of the daily news of the war in an insightful overall context for me, so I highly recommend it. General Ryan, congrats on another impressive book, and thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Bill. It's great to talk to you, and thank you again to the wonderful team at Naval Institute Books. They're just inspiring.
I'll pass that on to Adam Kane and his team. Yeah, they're great people. All right. Well, this episode is brought to you by Booz Allen. Accelerate today's missions with tomorrow's technologies as the leader in providing AI solutions to the federal government and one of the world's largest cybersecurity providers. Booz Allen advances game-changing capabilities rapidly, ethically, and securely. Learn more at boozallen.com/defense. And don't forget, coming up on 17 October, the Naval Institute and the Naval Academy will be co-hosting our annual fall conference. This one is focused on energy security, infrastructure, and the defense industrial base. Pulitzer Prize-winning author Daniel Yergin will be the morning keynote speaker, and Secretary of the Navy Carlos Del Toro will be our afternoon keynote. You can attend in person at the Naval Institute's Jack C. Taylor Conference Center or virtually. Just go to usni.org/events to register. I hope to see you there on the 17th. Until then, remember, victory begins at the Naval Institute.